February 1945, Eastern France. Snow slashed sideways through the pines, white knives in a gray storm. Our tank, Sherman Falcon Two, shuddered beneath the wind and the distant concussion of artillery. Inside the turret, the air was thick with oil fumes and breath-frozen midair. The steel walls groaned with every hit to the ground outside, like an animal too tired to move. I pressed my palm to the Brownings casing. It was dead cold. The machine G*N trembled faintly, not alive, not dead, just waiting. The G*N's finished, Captain Hollis said, voice flat over the static of the intercom. If it jams again, we're finished too. No one replied. The loader, Ray Turner, stared at the empty ammo boxes stacked under his boots. The brass smell of spent shells clung to the air like smoke. Outside, the forest screamed with wind. Inside, silence. Somewhere deep in my chest, colder than the snow outside, a thought settled and refused to leave. How did it come to this? Morvan Forest, France. The war's last winter had teeth. The needles and bark held a crust of rime, and every gust lifted knives of snow that found the seam in your scarf and cut straight to the heart. We were east of the river, on a forest road that mattered more than any of us, a thin vein that still carried fuel, rations, plasma, and hope. Our map called it a lateral, the men called it the only way anyone got out. I was the loader on Falcon Two, a late M4A3 with a 75 and a temper. We were a small piece of the 3rd Armored Division screen, wedged among pines and half-buried stumps, tasked with holding a bend that could funnel trucks by night. Hold meant stay visible enough to deter, hidden enough to live, and stubborn enough to pretend both could happen at once. Regulations rode with us, tucked between field manuals and ration tins. No field modifications to We*P*NS or feed systems. No non-standard lubricants. No improvisation on ammunition. Somewhere in the rear, a colonel's signature had turned all that into law. On paper, everything had a number, a torque value, a shelf life. On paper, the belts fed, the radios spoke, the fuel flowed. Out here, paper burned well and nothing else obeyed. The cold did strange things. Oil thickened to honey and then to glass. Breath iced the inside of sighting prisms. Recoil cylinders coughed. Even the turret race felt gritty, as if the teeth were chewing sand. Our SCR-508 could talk to no one for hours, then suddenly spit a burst of vowels, a ghost of a voice, before drowning again in static. We kept the set wrapped in a blanket like a sick child and thumped it when we were lonely. The belts were worst. Standard Brownings liked their links neat and their fabric willing. In this weather the cloth drank mist and froze, the metal lost its give, and the whole run turned to a corrugated stick. You could warm one belt under your jacket and feed it smooth, only to find the next had become a length of firewood. We tried everything the book condemned, a trace of stove fuel on the canvas, heat from the exhaust grill, a prayer over the ammo box before dawn. The G*N paid us back by jamming at the first burst, a stubborn, choking cough that sounded like surrender. We weren't losing men to panzers that week so much as to weather and waiting. Trucks slid sideways into ditches. A half-track toppled slow as a falling barn. A medic froze at his post because he wouldn't stop keeping hands warm that were not his own. When an artillery mission finally landed, it felt less like a plan and more like a reminder that someone back there remembered our grid square. Captain Hollis was all-cornered caution. His voice came filtered through the intercom, dry and exact. We hold the road. We do not create problems for supply. We do not fire unless necessary. We do not alter government property. The last line always hovered, like frost that never melts. I heard it even when he didn't say it. I heard the court-martial inside each syllable. But steel teaches its own doctrine. I could feel it in the way the Browning shivered when I touched it with a bare palm. In the way an empty ammo can sounded, not hollow, but final. In the way the driver, Win, let the engine idle with the firewall panel open, hugging heat like a stove in a cabin. The forest had a rhythm and the tank had a rhythm, and regulations knew neither. We shared our cops with 2 other Shermans and a wee *P*NS carrier that leaked out the last kindness from its radiator each night. The men wore scarves knitted by sisters they hadn't seen since basic. Someone strung a wire between trees for drying socks, the socks froze, became a line of pale flags. Our rations tasted of tin and Triumph that had gone stale. We chewed anyway. At dusk, snow turned gray-purple and the road took on a shine that made every tread mark red like writing. You could trace panic by the width of the grooves, calm by the evenness of a turn. I learned more from those lines than from the dead radio, more from the pitch of wind through the scoop than from any briefing. And still the order held, no changes, no cleverness, no heroics. I kept my mouth shut. I kept my kit hidden. I kept stitching when no one watched. Because the front didn't care for paper. The front cared for what ran and what didn't, what jammed and what sang, what froze and what could be coaxed back to life with warmth from the human body and a little grease rubbed into cloth. The forest cared for silence. The road cared for weight. The tank cared for feed and fire. And I cared, against orders, for the one thing that might keep our G*N alive when the river of trucks needed one more minute of cover. The storm was building. You could hear it in the timber and in the gaps between shells. You could smell it in the exhaust, a sour, over-rich note that meant something upwind was idling long and hard. Somewhere beyond the bend, somebody else was holding something that mattered. I set my palm on the Browning one more time and felt nothing but cold. On paper, we were ready. In steel, we were not. Before uniforms and serial numbers, before the frost welded steel to skin, I was just a mechanic from Jefferson County, Iowa. The kind of place where the horizon never curves, and a man can see the storm that will ruin his day 2 towns away. My father farmed 40 acres of corn and 80 of dust. I fixed what the dust left behind. Engines were my language long before English ever made sense. At 16 I could listen to a machine and tell you what part of it was lonely. I worked in a small shed behind the feed store, a single bulb swinging from a cord, the air thick with kerosene and chaff. Every tractor that came in was half dead, every owner poorer than the last, and somehow each expected a miracle from a boy with calloused fingers and a coffee can of bolts. I learned early that perfection didn't live in manuals. Manuals were for men who'd never knelt in mud to tighten a bolt by feel because the wrench was too cold to hold. My motto, scrawled in grease on the wall above the workbench, was simple: if it moves, it can move better. I wasn't a talker. I measured conversations like I measured threads, precise, functional, never wasted. My sister Ruth used to tease that I'd probably marry a gearbox if it had a decent carburetor. She wasn't far off. I wrote to her every Sunday after chores, mostly about engines. Once I sent her a note that said, "One loose bolt can stop a whole machine. Guess it's the same with people." She framed it, though I never meant it poetic. I just meant it true. When the war started, Jefferson County changed overnight. The depot filled with boys who'd never been farther than Des Moines, all pretending they weren't afraid. Posters shouted from every fence post, "Victory needs mechanics, engineers, drivers." I read them the way other men read scripture. It didn't feel like patriotism. It felt like gravity. I enlisted in '42, thinking I'd end up in a motor pool somewhere dry and predictable. Instead, the Army taught me that predictability is a luxury. They gave me a uniform, a serial number, and a toolkit that weighed more than decency. Fort Knox first, then Camp Campbell, then a ship that smelled of diesel and vomit bound for England. Somewhere in that crossing, Iowa fell off the map. What the Army called training was mostly endurance. Long hours, short tempers, endless lectures on procedure. Everything had a rule, and every rule existed because someone before us had died breaking it. The instructors spoke with the conviction of prophets. Never modify P***N components. Never substitute lubricants. Never improvise feed systems. They said it so often it became a kind of hymn. I learned it by heart even as a small, traitorous part of me began filing exceptions in the back of my head. In England, before we shipped to France, I spent evenings in the motor shed repairing anything that didn't belong to anyone. Jeeps, half-tracks, a field generator. The sergeant in charge noticed and told me I had the wrong sort of curiosity. He meant it as a warning. I took it as compliment. Machines talk if you listen without ego. They tell you what the engineers missed, what the field will destroy, what the manual refuses to admit. That was where I met my future tank crew, Hollis, the captain with nerves carved from regulation, Wynne, our driver, who treated the clutch like a dance partner, and Bishop, our G***ner, whose humor had a half-life shorter than a shell fuse. They laughed at my habits, testing oil viscosity by smell, measuring spring tension with fingers instead of gauges, sewing torn straps instead of requisitioning new ones. Turner's tool bag looks like his mother packed it, Wynne once joked. He was half right. My mother had given me a small sewing kit before I left Iowa. Just a tin box, needles, and thread wrapped around a wooden spool. Machines aren't the only things that need mending, she'd said. I slipped it into the corner of my duffel and never thought about it again, until France. By the time we landed at Omaha Beach, the kit had rusted along its hinge, but the thread was still good. The invasion tore through Normandy like a plow through wet soil, and behind it came the armor, our armor, grinding forward on tracks that screamed against the stone roads. In that noise, a man either went deaf or found rhythm. I found rhythm. The tank was just another engine, larger, louder, meaner, but still an engine that could be coaxed into sense if you listened. We fought through hedgerows thick enough to stop thought, through villages whose names I never learned. We burned fuel like oxygen and believed orders like prayer. Every week someone didn't make it, and every week new faces filled the gaps, already looking older than they were. I kept fixing, adjusting, tuning. I started signing my maintenance logs with small notes: feed linkage tight, G***N belt stiff, recommend lighter oil. They vanished into paperwork. France turned colder as the months folded into winter. Supply grew thin, tempers thinner. Somewhere around the Moselle, I began noticing how the Brownings jammed after long bursts. The belts came back stiff, their fabric frozen into arcs. When I tried to feed one by hand, it cracked like kindling. The quartermaster said, "Keep them dry." As if dryness existed in a tank. That night I found my mother's sewing kit. I opened it under candlelight and touched the needle like a relic. Thread still strong. I didn't know what I meant to do, only that the thought of dying because a strip of frozen cloth refused to bend seemed obscene. So I began experimenting. A square of parachute silk from a wrecked drop zone. A slice of rubber strap cut from a jerrycan harness. Cotton from a seat cover. I tested each for flexibility, for grip, for tolerance to oil and frost. It was the same curiosity that once fixed tractors, now aimed at survival. I wasn't inventing anything noble. I was just trying to keep the G***N alive long enough to see daylight. They say war makes engineers of all men. I think it only reveals which ones were already building something in their heads. I kept the kit beside my rations. Some nights I'd pull it out and sew, tiny even stitches, the thread gleaming in lantern light while the others played cards. They teased me for it, called it my bedtime embroidery. But my hands stayed busy, and my mind stayed warm. When people ask later why I risked so much on a strip of cloth and grease, I tell them the truth: I never saw it as risk. I saw it as repair. And if it moves, it can move better. By January, the cold had a sound. A soft crackle inside your lungs every time you breathed too deep. A whine from the engine before it turned over, like it wanted to stay asleep. The war had slowed to a crawl, steel against snow, men against machines that refused to behave. That was when the belt started dying for good. We first noticed it outside Auten. The G*N jammed mid-burst, 3 rounds deep. Bishop cursed, yanked the charging handle, and ended up with torn gloves and a useless coil of frozen canvas. The next belt was worse. It fed 2 feet and locked. The link split where the fabric had gone brittle. Captain Hollis just said, "Log it." We did. We always did. Nothing came back. After the 3rd jam, I began keeping fragments. I laid them out at night, strips of fabric, warped brass, bits of frayed stitching, and studied them the way some men study photographs of home. Every break told a story, water swelling inside the weave, oil thickening in the threads, temperature driving the fabric past its tolerance. There was logic in the failure, and logic meant it could be undone. That night, under the tarpaulin stretched over Falcon 2, I started cutting. Parachute silk from a damaged drop canopy, thin, strong, less absorbent. Then a strip of rubber scavenged from a fuel can strap. I sliced them into long, narrow lengths, laid them together, and ran my mother's needle through both. The waxed thread slid cleanly, the seam tight. I sewed loops at measured intervals, spacing them with an empty cartridge case. The smell of grease and candle soot hung low. Outside, the forest creaked in the frost. My fingers ached but didn't stop. Stitch by stitch, a shape appeared, crude, fragile, but alive. When I was done, I held it up in the candlelight. It shimmered like something out of place, silk and rubber, field-borne and unapproved. The next morning, Bishop spotted it first. "What's that, Turner? You making scarves for bullets now?" Wynne laughed so hard the driver's hatch shook. "Look at him, the tank tailor." Even Hollis glanced over, one eyebrow raised. "Explain yourself, loader." I told them, standard belts froze, fabric cracked, links warped. Silk resisted moisture. Rubber gave flexibility. The loops, hand-stitched, held better alignment. In theory, it would feed smoother under cold conditions. Hollis listened the way an officer listens when he's already decided the answer. "Regulations forbid field modification of ammunition feed systems," he said. "That's not a suggestion, Turner." "I know, sir." "Then burn it. Before someone thinks we're testing unauthorized gear." I didn't burn it. I folded it carefully and tucked it under my seat. That night, I made another. Soon, the tank smelled of wax, silk, and quiet defiance. The others ignored me after a while. "Let the loader play his games," they said. We had bigger worries, fuel convoys stuck in drifts, engines refusing to start, half our rations frozen solid. Each evening, after lights out, I kept working. The needle clicked through cloth, steady as a metronome. Wynne snored. Bishop mumbled in his sleep. Hollis reviewed maps under a flashlight, pretending not to notice. I tested the belts during downtime. Loaded dummy rounds, cycled the G*N by hand. No snags. The silk slid clean. I marked the pattern on the inside of my notebook, stitch count, material ratio, grease type. It wasn't invention, it was adaptation. But adaptation is what the manual feared most. 2 weeks later, during a brief lull near Salu, a supply officer made his rounds. Young, pressed uniform, clipboard bright enough to be seen from orbit. He saw me testing the belt. "What's this contraption?" "Experimental feed, sir," I said before I could stop myself. His expression curdled. "Experimental? You're in a tank battalion, not a sewing club." "Yes, sir." He made a note and walked off, boots crunching in disgust. When he was gone, Bishop grinned. "See, Turner? Even the brass thinks you're nuts." "Maybe," I said. "But nuts keep the wheels turning." By the end of January, the jamming got worse across the line. Reports filtered through the grapevine, Brownings freezing solid, belts snapping mid-burst. Crews tried everything, heating ammo boxes near exhaust vents, soaking belts in gasoline, even pissing on them to thaw the ice. Nothing worked for long. The front was eating patience faster than ammunition. That was when I knew the rule had to break before we did. I began refining the design. Wax instead of oil, less viscous, more resistant to frost. A thread of copper wire woven through the edge to maintain shape. Small rubber spacers inside the loops to prevent drag. Each version better than the last. Each one hidden deeper in the tank. The others kept laughing, but the laughter thinned as their G*NS kept jamming. I waited. I could have forced the issue, demanded a test, but that would have made it official, and official meant dead. The trick was to stay invisible until the moment of necessity. Every soldier dreams of a moment when his idea saves lives. No one tells you it comes wrapped in silence, ridicule, and the smell of burnt oil. One night, as I stitched by the glow of a Coleman lantern, Wynne muttered from his seat, half asleep. "You know, Turner, if that crazy thing of yours ever works, I'll buy you a drink in heaven." I didn't answer. The needle kept moving. Outside, the wind carried the dull thunder of G*NS too far away to matter, yet. The snow had hardened into glass, and our road gleamed under the moon like a blade. I ran my fingers along the finished belt. Smooth, flexible, unyielding. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't approved. But it was ready. And somewhere beyond the trees, the kind of storm that makes or breaks rules was already gathering its strength. February 17, 1945. The wind came first, then the noise. A low, distant growl that didn't belong to weather. It was the sound of treads crushing frozen earth, the sound of engines that drank gasoline and exhaled war. The forest around us seemed to lean away from it, every branch stiff with listening. We'd been holding the same bend in the Morven Road for 3 days. Our maps called it Grid 22C. We called it the Blind Corner, because nothing ever came around it slow. The snow had turned gray from exhaust and blood. The other Shermans, Falcon 1, 3, and 5, were positioned 50 yards apart, half dug into the embankment. By dawn, only ours was still moving. The storm hit at 0600. Not artillery at first, but a white blizzard that flattened vision to 20 yards. The wind screamed through the antenna, a metallic whistle that made the whole tank hum. We huddled inside, the walls sweating frost. The radio spat gibberish, then silence. At 0615 the first shell landed. A German probing SH*T, short by 50 meters, enough to shake the turret. Hollis barked through the intercom, "Driver, hold fast. G*NR, eyes front." The next one hit closer. Snow exploded over the periscope. The shock rolled through the hull, and somewhere under the engine deck, coolant hissed like steam escaping a grave. Through the haze, I caught a glimpse, dark shapes moving between the trees, the silhouettes of Panzer IVs advancing under cover of infantry. Their barrels flashed pale light through the fog, quick and sharp. The shells whistled overhead and burst against the ridge behind us. Wind slammed the transmission into neutral, keeping the engine idling to feed power to the Traverse. Bishop gripped the trigger, finger trembling above the guard. "Hold until contact," Hollis said. His voice was calm, mathematical. I envied that calm. Then the storm thickened. Snow and smoke blended into one solid curtain. The visibility gauge on the periscope might as well have read blind. You could sense movement only by vibration, the ground flexing, the armor moaning as distant blasts rolled through it. At 0623, one of the friendly Shermans called over the net, "Falcon 3 hit." Losing pressure, then static. A fireball bloomed somewhere to our right, orange bleeding through the snow. The blast wave made our suspension groan. Falcon 1, report. Hollis snapped. Nothing. In the next minute, 2 more concussions, both too close. The ridge had become a slaughter pit. Inside Falcon 2, the air thickened with cordite and breath. Frost formed on the ceiling. Bishop loaded the 75, and I could hear his teeth clicking through the intercom. He was scared. So was I. When the German armor broke through the tree line, it looked like an avalanche made of iron. 3 panzers in a staggered line, G*NS already elevated. Behind them, the ghostly blur of infantry in white smocks, rifles glinting. One of the tanks carried a cross half buried in snow, an insignia blackened by soot. They fired before we did. The shell struck 10 yards short, splintering a pine and showering us in ice and bark. I slammed the next round into the breech, shouted, "Up," and Bishop squeezed the trigger. Our 75 barked once, the recoil hammering my shoulder through the seat back. Through the periscope, I saw the German lead tank shudder. Its track lifted, sagged, then froze. Smoke poured from the drive sprocket. One crippled. Hollis shouted. "Keep it coming." The G*N roared again. The smell of powder filled the turret, a dry, bitter taste. Another panzer caught fire along the hull seam. But there were more, always more. Then came the sound I dreaded, a metallic cough from the coaxial. The Browning jammed. The belt had stiffened into a curved rod, feeding halfway before snapping. Spent cartridges rattled around the turret floor. Bishop cursed, tried to clear it, but the receiver was frozen solid. G*N's out, he yelled. Hollis didn't look up. "Switch to sidearm if you have to. Keep firing that main." I stared at the broken belt, fingers shaking, feeling something colder than fear. We had maybe 3 high-explosive shells left. The infantry were closing fast. If they got close enough with Panzerfausts, we'd be a burning box. Outside, another American tank detonated. The sky went white, then black. Snow turned to ash. That's when the thought hit me, not loud, just absolute. If we follow the book, we die by the book. The regulation was clear: do not alter feed systems, do not use non-standard equipment. But what good were rules to corpses? I tore off my gloves and reached under the loader's seat. My fingers found the waxed bundle I'd hidden there weeks ago, silk, rubber, and grease wrapped in brown paper. My heart beat so hard it blurred my vision. Wynne glanced back. "Turner, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. I was already unwrapping the belt. The silk glowed faintly in the half-light, soft and defiant. The intercom crackled. "Hollis, loader, status." "Working it," I said. My voice sounded foreign, deliberate. Another shell burst outside, close enough to lift us off the treads. Bishop swore. The engine coughed. I ignored them all. I fed the first loop into the receiver. It slid smooth, no stiffness. I pulled the charging handle, chambered around. The G*N felt alive again, almost eager. A shadow loomed through the fog, German infantry, 30 yards and closing. One carried a Panzerfaust, its warhead gleaming dull green. G*N up. I shouted. The Browning answered. Not with a cough or a choke, but a long, rolling growl. The silk belt ran like warm water through the feed tray, the brass cycling clean, steady. The barrel glowed. Shell casings poured like rain onto the floor. I didn't stop. Not until the snow in front of us turned to a storm of mud and red. Falcon 2 was alive again, and for the first time in days, so were we. But even as the G*N roared, even as the others shouted, I knew what it meant. The moment I'd pulled that trigger with a forbidden belt, I'd crossed a line that regulations didn't have a word for. And yet, out there in the gray storm, it was the only line that mattered. I held the bundle in both hands the way a man holds a fuse he means to light. Silk, rubber, wax, and a seam my mother would have scolded, crooked in places, strong where it mattered. The intercom hissed with Hollis's impatience and distant artillery. Somewhere to our right, an American engine screamed once and then went silent. I could feel the tank's breath on my face, hot from the engine bay, cold everywhere else. "Turner," Hollis said, "status of the cokes." "Clearing jam," I lied. What I was clearing was the last inch of obedience. I tore the dead belt free. It came away in splinters, canvas flaking like old paint. My fingers stuck to the receiver, skin tore when I pulled back. I fed the first loop of the homemade belt into the tray and thumbed the top round into alignment. The silk slid without complaint. The rubber core kept the shape. The waxed thread glinted like wet wire. "Don't touch non-standard gear," Hollis said, as if he were in the turret with my hands. "That's an order." Outside, a shape lifted from the snow with a Panzerfaust on its shoulder. The warhead had frost on it, white on green like lichen. He was close enough that I could see his breath. D men don't need regulations. I racked the charging handle. The bolt came home with a sound like a door shutting. "Up," I said, and the word left my mouth calm as a measurement. Bishop squeezed the butterfly triggers. The G*N did not cough. It roared, a long, continuous animal sound that filled the turret and pulled the smell of cordite into our teeth. The barrel began its slow red bloom. The silk belt paid out smooth, graceful as rope over a capstan. The first man fell, the Panzerfaust spun off into the drifts unfired, and the others flattened into the snow as if the earth had called them by name. Holy, wind started, and then the tank shivered under a near hit and shook the rest out of him. I rode the feed with my left hand, guiding the belt along the tray so the loops did not bite the edge. Every 10 seconds I nudged the drum downward so the column wouldn't kink. Every 30 I tapped the receiver cover to check for rime. The wax held. The grease stayed supple. The links ran hot and clean. Brass clattered onto the turret floor until the soles of our boots rang like cymbals. "Turner," Hollis said again, softer now. "What is that?" "Insurance," I answered. We stitched the fog. The G*N traced short arcs, 3-second bursts, then 2, never longer. The new belt made cadence easy, there was no wrestling, no ritual of curse and yank. It was just engineering behaving, a system flowing, a line on graph paper come true. In the gaps between bursts I swapped glove hands, flexed the raw one, and listened for wrong notes, a drag, a stutter, a pitch that meant friction was climbing. "Nothing," she sang. The infantry broke. Some ran. Some went to ground behind trunks that turned to splinters under the heavy rounds. One tried to crawl for the Faust he had dropped. The sight picture stayed clear because I kept brushing snow from the sight hood with the back of my wrist. Little motions. Necessary heresies. When the barrel threatened to cook, I yelled, "Swap." Bishop locked the bolt, I snapped the latch, and we eased the hot steel free. The spare came from its canvas sleeve like a winter fish from a net. I seated it, clamped down, and slapped the cover. Up. The Browning found its voice again without complaint. That was the test I had feared, heat changes everything. The belt did not care. Silk and rubber don't seize from a little warmth. Fabric belts did. We walked the edge of the road and cut a mouth into the fog. Hollis directed fire with numbers, bearing 142, depression 3, short. His voice had lost the courtroom tone. It had the flat music of trust. He knew now that arguing with results is a luxury for men under roofs. A Panzer nosed into view, turret coke spitting. The round sparked off our mantlet like angry bees. Bishop swung the 75, Hollis called, tree line, mark. I slammed the shell home, shouted, "Up," and the main G*N spoke thunder. Snow leapt. The German tank recoiled into its own smoke. We raked the gap with the Browning, long enough to make them doubt, short enough to save the throat of the barrel. Somewhere in the blur a thought surfaced, slow and cold: if the G*N held because of me, then so did every life behind us. The road, the trucks, the medics with their plasma, the men who would not freeze because we bought them time, all of it rode a seam stitched by a farmhand who had decided the manual did not apply to winter. The belt neared its last loops. I eased the tail with 2 fingers so the final rounds would not nosedive. The drum thinned, the feed stayed true. When the last cartridge slid through, the bolt rode home on emptiness with a satisfied click. My hands trembled for the first time. I tore open the waxed paper on the second bundle. Silk, rubber, thread. I had made 3, total. Enough if we spent them like a miser. I fed the new belt and saw my blood on the loops, small crescents where the needlework had stolen skin days ago. It looked like a signature. Hollis said, almost to himself, "You just bought us the difference between a position and a grave." "Keep calling targets," I said. We did. Minute by minute, the line stopped being a guess and became a fact. Falcon 2 did what a tank is supposed to do: it denied ground. Not with brilliance, not with luck, with continuity. The simplest victory on earth. Break the rule, keep the rhythm. That was all. And if anyone later asked whether I'd heard the order not to, I would tell them yes. I heard it in my head even as the belt slid under my palm. I heard it and I measured it against the sight of a man lifting a Panzerfaust at 30 yards. The measurement was not close. Minutes became hours, though the clock on the dashboard had long stopped under the vibration. The storm pressed down until sky and earth blurred into a single sheet of motion, a gray curtain stitched by tracer fire. Inside Falcon 2, every surface shook with the rhythm of the Browning, our strange, miraculous rhythm. The first belt burned through without a single jam. I changed it blind, by feel alone. The silk stayed pliant even when it smoked. When the second ran, I fed it slow, guiding each loop like thread through a loom. The receiver glowed cherry. The smell of oil and cordite mixed with sweat so thick it tasted metallic. We had become a sound: G*fire, engine hum, breath. No conversation. Only survival reduced to repetition. Somewhere beyond the fog, the German assault faltered. We couldn't see them clearly, just fragments, the silhouette of a panzer slewing sideways in the drifts, a cluster of infantry crawling for cover, a flare arcing then vanishing into the storm. Each time they tried to regroup, our fire cut the formation back to pieces. Not rapid, not panicked, steady, measured bursts that gave the illusion of abundance. "Short," Hollis would say. "Now lift 2 degrees." And Bishop would nudge the trigger, letting the G*N speak again in neat, clean phrases. Falcon 2's voice never cracked, never coughed. To anyone listening across the line, it sounded like an entire company anchored in the trees. Wind kept the engine idling at just enough throttle to heat the oil lines. Every few minutes he adjusted the nose angle so the glacis caught snow instead of shrapnel. The man treated 50 tons of steel like a farm tractor he couldn't afford to dent. I caught him once glancing at the belt feeding through my hand, half fear, half awe. "You sure that thing doesn't have a soul?" he muttered through the intercom. "Depends who's listening," I said. We weren't supposed to talk during contact. But the silence outside demanded words, anything to remind us that we were still men and not parts. I remember the way the casings piled up, hot brass rolling underfoot until it filled the turret floor like river stones. Each one a second survived. The Germans shifted tactics. They stopped pushing armor down the road and started probing with infantry, small teams moving through the gullies to flank. The snow gave them away, bright fountains rising with each step. We cut them down, again and again, until the slope was a canvas of red mist and white churn. Not pride. Not vengeance. Just the mechanic's satisfaction of something working exactly as designed. At some point Hollis leaned against the turret wall, eyes hollow from smoke. He said quietly, "They think we're more than we are." "They always do," Bishop replied. Then the radio came alive for the first time in hours. Static, then a voice buried in distortion. "Position holding?" "Repeat, who's still operational?" Hollis grabbed the handset. "Falcon 2, still active. Engaged with armor. Limited ammo." "Copy that, Falcon 2. Reinforcements en route from the south. Hold for 30 minutes." We had already been fighting for 3 hours. I looked at the ammo bin, 2 belts left, both homemade. No he shells. No coolant left for the G*N barrel. Only the rhythm, the pattern we had built. 30 it is, Hollis said. His voice didn't tremble. He might as well have said, "We breathe 30 more times." The next wave came at 0930. Not tanks this time but trucks full of infantry and a single self-propelled G*N backing them. They advanced cautiously, expecting ambush fire from several tanks. What they found was one G*N that refused to quit. I watched through the periscope as the first truck erupted. The second turned sideways, blocking the rest. The self-propelled G*N fired blind into the smoke, its shell over *T, detonating harmlessly in the trees. Every time the recoil kicked, the G*N sang smoother. The silk had polished itself against the receiver, a living thing that wanted to feed. I knew the mechanics of it, the friction coefficient, the tension, but it still felt alive. A creature built from disobedience and thread. Bishop's voice cracked through the intercom. "They're pulling back." It was true. Through the gray we saw the enemy retreating, dragging the wounded, abandoning one of their panzers where it had bogged nose first in the ditch. The sound of their engines faded like a storm rolling backward. Silence followed, absolute and heavy. The barrels smoked. The forest hissed with melting snow. We sat without moving, every nerve waiting for the next blow that didn't come. Hollis finally exhaled. "Turner," he said, "you and your sewing kit just saved a division." I didn't answer. I was staring at the spent belt coiled at my feet. The silk was blackened with powder, the rubber edges nicked, but it was intact. Perfectly intact. Proof of concept written in carbon and blood. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried a smell I hadn't realized I missed, diesel mixed with pine sap instead of cordite. Reinforcements. The deep, throaty churn of Shermans moving up the road. The sound of engines that meant we had not been forgotten. When the first of them came into view, their commanders stared at us as if we were ghosts. Falcon 2 was still idling, G*N barrel glowing dull red, hull streaked with soot and frost. The others in our platoon were nothing but twisted shapes under smoke. For a moment, even the new arrivals held their fire, as if approaching something sacred. Hollis climbed halfway out of the hatch, waving a signal flag. I saw him pause, look down at me, then say quietly, "You'll want to write this up, Turner." I shook my head. "It's not regulation." He smiled, just a fraction, but it was the first human thing I'd seen on his face since autumn. "Then let's pretend the rulebook froze too." The relief that followed didn't feel like victory. It felt mechanical, the way a stalled engine finally catches and idles rough but alive. I cleaned the G*N by rote, coiling the burnt belt with care, laying it on my lap like a medal no one would issue. Outside, the forest went silent again, except for the whisper of wind through the pine needles. The snow kept falling, erasing everything except the tracks that led away from us. And in that quiet I realized that war wasn't about courage or faith, it was about friction. About what moved and what didn't. And for once, for one impossible morning in February, the machine had moved because I refused to let it stop. They pulled us out at dusk. The forest had turned to glass, every branch coated in ice, every sound sharpened by the cold. The recovery team arrived in half-light, their trucks grinding over shell casings that cracked like bone under the tires. We were still inside Falcon 2, letting the engine idle low to keep from freezing to death. The G*N barrel hissed as snow touched it, faint, almost polite. A major climbed onto the glacis, breath fogging. "Who the hell's still alive in there?" Hollis answered first, voice raw. "Falcon 2, complete crew." The major blinked. "Complete?" He looked around. The other tanks were husks, their tracks twisted like ribbons. Smoke rose from the one that had burned all morning. "You're telling me this was all you?" No one corrected him. "They made us climb out." The air bit at my face, hot skin meeting frozen air. My legs almost refused the ladder, the muscles were jelly from hours crouched in steel. I dropped into the snow and nearly went to my knees. Hollis grabbed my arm and steadied me. The road behind us was a museum of wreckage, German hulls half buried in drifts, their paint scorched to gray, their G*NS pointed nowhere. The battlefield looked deliberate, as if someone had drawn it with a ruler and a match. An officer approached, clipboard tucked under his arm. "We're inspecting P*NS for mechanical failure. Any irregular equipment used?" Hollis didn't look at me. "Negative. Standard operation." The man nodded, scribbled something, and moved on. I could feel Hollis's silence pressing against me like a warning, this never happened. But it had. My proof lay coiled inside the tank, blackened and warm. Later, back at the temporary bivouac, I sat under a torn canvas lean-to with the Brownings feed cover open on my lap. The inspectors came again, this time slower, curious. The G*N drew them like a relic. They ran fingers along the chamber, whistled low. "No jams, no frost scoring," one said. "Impossible in this temperature." The major returned. "What lubricant did you use?" "Standard issue," I said. My voice betrayed nothing. He leaned closer. "You an engineer or something?" I shook my head. "Just hate when things break." He laughed once, clipped. "Good attitude. We could use more of it in ordnance." Then he walked away, none the wiser. Within 48 hours, the report spread through the division. Falcon 2 holds the line. No one mentioned how. Officially, the victory belonged to combined arms, coordinated defense, superior training. Unofficially, the men started calling our ammo belt Turner Strip. At first it was a joke. They'd say it when a P*N jammed, "Get yourself a Turner Strip." But the phrase stuck. Someone found parachute silk and began sewing imitations. Mechanics tested them near the engine heat, curious. Within a week, half the machine G*NS in our sector carried belts that no requisition officer had ever signed for. The army moved slower than weather, soldiers didn't. I was reassigned to supply duty 3 days later. They said it was a commendation, a way to standardize field practices. Hollis shook my hand before I left. His grip was firm, his eyes unreadable. "You'll do more good there than in a turret," he said. "Just keep your mouth closed." He meant about the rule I'd broken. I meant to obey. But word has its own routes, it travels in smoke and rumor, faster than trucks. The supply camp sat at the edge of a ruined village. Tents flapped against the wind, their ropes stiff with ice. A single stove hissed inside the canvas where I worked. My hands, still raw from recoil, found the rhythm again: cut, stitch, grease, dry. Parachute silk, tent canvas, seat straps, anything that could bend without breaking. Each belt took hours. I used the same needle my mother packed, worn smooth from work. Sometimes the artillery spoke in the distance. The sound no longer startled me, it was just weather with punctuation. Between bursts, I could hear the clicking of the sewing needle, a small, defiant heartbeat against the larger one of war. Other mechanics began stopping by. They'd bring me coffee, a handful of brass, or just questions. "Heard you got the Brownings singing again. What's the trick?" I'd show them, quiet and practical, the weave of silk, the wax, the measured loops. No speeches, no pride. Just function. By March, the first official requests arrived for improvised flexible feed assemblies. Someone in headquarters was trying to name it without naming me. I didn't care. The belts worked, that was enough. One evening a young lieutenant from Ordnance came through, notebook in hand. "Turner, right?" he asked. "Mind if I observe?" "Nothing to see," I said. "Just sewing." He smiled. "That's the thing. Everyone keeps calling it engineering." He watched me for an hour, taking notes on every motion. When he left, he shook my hand. "You might have shortened this war," he said. I didn't answer. I knew the war wasn't done, only dying slow. When the final thaw came, the forest roads turned to rivers of mud. The tanks rolled east toward Germany. I stayed behind with the supply trucks, patching belts, cleaning G*NS. My hands no longer trembled. They only moved, mechanical, certain. At night, I'd sit outside the tent, needle cooling in my pocket, watching the sky bruise from red to black. Sometimes I thought about home, Iowa's flat fields, the tractor shed, the note Ruth kept framed. "One loose bolt," I'd written, "can stop a whole machine." I wondered what she'd think if she knew her brother had fixed one. The Army never made it official. No medals, no citations. Just a notation in the quartermaster's report, "Field adaptation successful, recommend further study." But every man who fired a G*N that winter knew the truth. They'd seen silk feed where canvas froze, seen rules bend and lives remain. And as spring crept into the ruins, the nickname traveled farther east with the tanks, Turner strips, they called them. I never asked for ownership. I only hoped they remembered why they worked, not because they were clever, but because someone refused to let the machine die obedient. In war, that's all invention ever is. A form of disobedience that happens to keep you breathing. I went home when the shooting stopped. Iowa met me with wind and silence, the kind that moves across fields without touching anything. I opened a small repair shop on the state road outside town, 2 bays, a potbelly stove, a window that looked west so the dusk could keep me honest. People brought me what the war had left behind, tractors with tired rings, trucks that drank oil like sorrow, balers that bound more twine than hay. I fixed them. Nothing heroic. Just parts, fit to purpose. I did not talk about France. If a customer asked where I'd served, I said, in the cold, and handed back a receipt that smelled of grease and paper. At night I would sit with the stove open, watching the iron glow, and listen to the click of cooling metal. Sometimes my hands would move in my sleep, the old rhythm of feeding a belt that no longer existed. Word traveled in ways I did not. A curator from Fort Benning wrote first, then a captain from Ordnance. They wanted a representative example of the field-made belt. I sent them the last one I had, the one I'd carried home wrapped in a rag inside my duffel. Months later, an envelope came with a black and white photograph, a glass case, a frayed loop dark with powder, a little placard beneath it that read, "Turner's trick, the belt that kept a Sherman shooting." I studied the picture under the lamp. The belt looked fragile in captivity. I could see where my blood had spotted the rubber edge the night the needle slipped, the stain printed gray in the emulsion like a weather mark on a barn door. I put the photograph back in its sleeve and returned to a carburetor that needed float adjustment. History does not forgive idling. Every December I hung a sign on the garage door, "Keep it running." Customers thought it was a holiday joke, something a mechanic would say because starters fail when the mercury falls. It was not a joke. It was a rule written colder and deeper than any I had disobeyed. Men from the county would sometimes bring their sons to see the shop. They said, "This is Ray. He can fix anything." The boys would look around at the racks of belts and hoses and ask where I learned it all. In a shed, I'd answer. And in a place where learning fast kept people alive. Their fathers would change the subject. That was fine with me. Once, years after, I drove south on business and stopped at the museum. The air inside was conditioned to a temperature that felt like memory. Tank sat under lights as if waiting for judgment. I found the case without asking. The belt hung in a gentle curve, a single seam catching the bulb's reflection. A guide led a group past, reciting facts about bore diameters and muzzle velocities. No one stopped. Why would they? It was just cloth and rubber, thread and stubbornness. I stood there until the glass fogged faintly for my breath and then I left. Outside, the sun felt wrong, too warm for that kind of looking. Hollis wrote me once, from an address I didn't recognize. His handwriting was as neat as his orders. They're testing flexible feeds in procurement now. Somebody will get credit. It ought to be you. I'm aware that it won't be. I folded the letter and slid it between 2 pages of the parts catalog I used most. I am an orderly man. I keep things where I can find them and never look again. The shop aged the way machines do, quietly, by fractions. Paint peeled, concrete cracked, the stove burned through one grate and then another. I replaced each failure in turn. On winter mornings I'd unlock the side door to the smell of oil and frost, and I would think of Morven, snow moving sideways, steel that felt alive under the hand, a captain's voice flattened by static. I never heard the G***N in my head. Only the feed, that patient, obedient slide. Sometimes a veteran would stop and say he'd heard of Turner Strip somewhere down the line. He'd ask if I remembered the pattern. I would draw it for him on the back of an invoice, loop spacing, wax mixture, how to cradle the belt so the last rounds didn't nosedive. He'd nod as if I had given him a map back to a country neither of us wished to visit. Then he'd pay cash for a fuel pump and drive away slow, mirrors set wide, checking for a threat that belonged to another century. I didn't keep medals. I kept tools. The sewing kit stayed in the top drawer, hinge rusted, spool half-used. Every so often I would open it, not to touch the needle, just to count that it was still there. When the store sold out of thread during a blizzard and a neighbor came knocking with a torn fan belt, I closed the drawer and cut him a strip from an inner tube instead. Some habits are for war alone. People like to say the war made heroes. I don't know any. I know men who understood friction, heat, and time, and who learned what to do when one of those tried to K***LL them. My belt was not invention, it was arithmetic performed at speed. Inputs, cold, oil, fabric, fear. Output, continuity of fire. You can dress it as legend if it helps you sleep. I prefer torque values and stitch counts. On the day I turned 60, Ruth brought the framed line I had sent her as a boy. One loose bolt can stop a whole machine. She hung it above the workbench while I shook my head. The glass caught the shop light, threw a square of brightness onto the hood of a Chevy that would not start. I set down my wrench and tightened a clamp I had already tightened once. The engine caught, hesitated, then chose to run. You take your victories where they accept you. So that is the legacy, if the word fits at all, a seam that held when other seams broke, and a habit of refusing to let a system fail just because paper said it should work. Somewhere in Georgia, a belt hangs under glass. Somewhere in France, a road still remembers an hour when a tank would not fall silent. Here, in Iowa, I unlock the door each morning, sweep brass filings from the floor, hang the sign in December, and do the one thing I learned better than any order. Keep it running. They laughed when I stitched it by candlelight, said I was sewing comfort into a coffin. They weren't wrong. Every man in that forest was already halfway gone. But when the snow came sideways and every other G*N froze silent, the laughter stopped. The silk belt fed, the barrel sang, and Falcon Two kept breathing while the rest turned to monuments. I don't remember pride, only the rhythm, the steady pulse of brass falling like rain. That sound carried farther than orders, farther than medals. They called it Turner's trick later, as if it were luck. It wasn't. It was logic, warmed by blood. Because war breaks machines the way winter breaks men, by degrees. And when both begin to fail, someone has to know which rule to ignore. That night, I chose the one that kept the G*N alive. And when all else ran dry, my stitch still fed fire through steel.